Everybody's become obsessed with living longer and they've forgotten about living better. This is something I heard Matthew McConaughey discussing on the Modern Wisdom podcast this week. And having heard it, it reminded me that it's an episode that I wanted to do on the podcast. Because I get a lot of patients who come and see me in the physiotherapy clinic who they come and see me clearly because they're in pain or they've got some discomfort. But alongside asking me about that, they're often asking me about what they can do to be healthier going forwards. And then they start to bring up things alongside intermittent fasting, any supplements they should be taking, whether they should be trying things they've heard about red light therapy, specific mattresses they might buy to help. And when I ask them a bit further about what they're currently doing, it becomes clear that they're not actually doing a lot of the basics right. They're not meeting the physical activity requirements set out by the World Health Organization. So they're 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise and 2 to 3 sessions of muscle strengthening per week. So that's kind of the very least we should be doing to try and think about a healthier, more active future. Because when I question them further, they're already starting to struggle with things like getting on and off the floor without using their hands, getting up a flight of stairs without having to hold on to the banister, sometimes nervous about playing with their grandchildren in case they tweak their back or something similar. And the problem is with focusing on a lot of things like Zoe and the continued glucose monitoring and the Whoop bands and all the things that are, the term I think is thrown out now is a kind of biohacking, is you forget about the actual basics that we should be focusing on first. And by focusing on all the biohacking techniques, it's all about adding years, but not necessarily quality to those years. And that's what I wanted to talk a bit more about today. There's a fantastic book that I often recommend to people called Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity by Peter Attia. And again, really in-depth book, fantastic, well worth a read or listen to. And I'll put it in the show notes below so you can find that on Amazon if you need to. But he has 2 main parts that I wanted to talk about within that book today. And he uses the idea of what we call the Centenarian Decathlon. And he talks about the marginal decade. So the idea of the Centenarian Decathlon is similar to a decathlon in athletics, where in athletics over 2 days, there's 10 events that the athletes perform. And it's the combined score that they get over all 10 events that decides who gets a gold, silver, or bronze. Now, he's taken this idea of 10 events and he's looked at or asked you the question is, when you reach 100 years old, what 10 events would you still like to be able to do? And he doesn't dictate there's a specific 10 events. He said it's very much your 10 events that you want for the lifestyle that you want to imagine when you're 100. So some of the examples might be what I mentioned, getting on and off the floor without using your hands, going up a flight of stairs without holding onto the banister, being able to pick up your grandchild or maybe even great-grandchild by then, maybe to go for a walk down to the local shop and back again, or maybe able to go on an hour-long walk. It's that envisaging what you would do at 100 and then working back from that to see what you can do to give yourself the best chance of being able to get to that point. It's not just about the goal of living to 100. It's really focusing on what can you do once you are 100. And then he talks about what we call the marginal decade of life. So I'm going to quote what he talks about here. So he says, we're all going to be in our last decade at some point. And outside of people who die suddenly or through an accident, most of us know when we're in that marginal decade. You might not know the day you enter it. Most people, you know, who are old enough, if you tell them, are you in your last decade of life? They probably have a sense that they are. Now, half the time they realize this because they've felt the decline in what they're able to do. And at that point, if that's your realization that you're in that last decade of life and you've hit that decline, it's often too late to do much about it at that stage. And if you ask people at this point in life, often they will say they wish they'd started taking action to try and be stronger and try and be fitter 10 or 20 years earlier. And they don't wish they started earlier because they want to live longer. They wish they started earlier because they want to be living better right now in that moment, in that marginal decade. And again, that brings us back to this whole point of let's not focus too much about living longer. Whenever our last decade is, let's see if we can enjoy that decade for as long as possible. And Peter Attia and other longevity kind of experts and people who've written books on this have talked about this idea of steepening the curve. Now, what that means, if we looked at a graph where we look at your level of function and we're looking for that over time or your kind of age range, initially it's going to start very high. So we've got a high level of function and that line stays pretty flat until you reach about 50 to 60. And then you see a slow, gradual decline until, say, we get to that 80, 90, 100. What Peter talks about in terms of steepening the curve is we'd rather keep that line flat for as long as possible and then have a sharp decline in the last year or two than have a slow, gradual decline all the way through. Because the higher that line stays for as long as possible, the more activities it opens up for us to be able to do, and the better the lifestyle we'll have and the healthier you are in other aspects. So he says the goal is to stay at a high plateau of function for as long as possible and then drop off quickly at the end, not a long, gradual slide into frailty. And then goes on to say that's why strength training is so critical, because you can't steepen the curve with cold plunges, supplements, red light therapy, new mattresses. You steepen it by building massive reserves of strength and fitness now, so that even as you decline, you're still above the threshold for being able to live independently and do the activities you want to be able to do. In preparing for this episode, it reminded me of a talk I went to probably about 10 years ago now. That was by Dan Hunt, who was a number 2 to David Brailsford for British Cycling and Team Sky. So he was working with people like Bradley Wiggins, Chris Froome, some of the other Tour de France winners, and also within Team GB within the Olympics and all the success they had there. But when he joined, they weren't having much success at all. And over time, Team Sky particularly, and David Brailsford got recognised or known for this 1% marginal gains theory. So for anyone who doesn't know what that was, if they made very small little tweaks, they found that if they could just improve performance by 0.5% or 1%, if they made enough small tweaks, to that could be to the kit or to the equipment they were using, or just nutritional things and supplements they might be taking, again, enough of these 1% added up together, so you did 10 changes, that suddenly is a 10% improvement in the performance. And in this talk that I went to with Dan Hunt, he was telling the audience that he almost regrets or hates the fact that everyone focused on this 1% marginal gains, because when he joined and they weren't having any success with Team GB, he was under a lot of pressure to try and make some of these 1% changes, and they wanted new kit, new equipment. They wanted to make tweaks in this thing, but he actually said and held firm and said, no, we're not doing any of that until we get the 80 to 90% right first. Then we can layer on the 1% changes. So then he focused on the consistent training, the discipline, the hard work, the basics of nutrition. And it's only once they started winning with what they already had, with the new core training principles in place, that they then started making those 1% changes. And that's where the real success came. His point was, a lot of people have this mindset of, all I need to do is make these little tweaks and these 1% changes. And back to my patients at the start that are asking me about the supplements and using their Whoop band or fitness tracker, or they want to try their Zoe and the continuous glucose monitoring to see sort of very minute, minuscule bits of data that might be able to change them a little bit. If they aren't doing the 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or the 75 minutes in vigorous intensity exercise, and they're not doing their 2 to 3 sessions of muscle strengthening per week, all those changes aren't really going to make any difference. You need to be layering it on top of your core training and your core principles first to really see the benefits. So what is that 80% for most of us? Let's go back to those physical activity guidelines. What can you do to fit in those 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise? Now, say we only looked at 5 days of the week, that's half an hour a day of moderate intensity exercise. That could be a brisk walk. It doesn't need to be a run or a cycle or anything that feels like too hard work. It's just getting out, getting the heart rate up. You want to be out of breath, or you increase work of breathing, but you're still able to maintain a conversation. So you can go with a friend and have a conversation at the same time. So if you want to add in a bit, and Peter Attia talks about this in his book, the bulk of what you want to do is what we call zone 2 training, where you are very low level, but increasing the heart rate enough. And then you do want to try and fit in some time where you do either break into a run and you're really trying to get your heart rate up for a short period of time and then back down again. But even if we forget about that for now and just try and fit in that kind of zone 2 or that moderate intensity training for 30 minutes a day for 5 days a week, you are going to start and you're going to tick and you've reached that target. And then let's try and fit the 2 sessions of muscle strengthening in per week. Again, without going into too much nuance with it, because I don't want to keep this as simple as possible, is we want to try and make sure that when you are doing strength training, it is actually strength training and not just doing exercises without a clear goal in mind. Because in order to build strength, we do have to try and push the muscles to the point of muscular fatigue so that the last repetitions you're aiming for are almost the last ones you could have managed. Again, I've talked about this a lot. I'm not going to go into too much of it here, but if you want, I'm going to link below to a couple of episodes. So one on the kind of general principles of strength training. That was episode 2. And then I'm going to talk about the 7 functional movement patterns. So again, I'll put that in there as well. I do also have a free ebook, which I'll link to below, or if you go to nevertooldtolift.com/ebook, and it will guide you through everything you need to know about the strength training principles, how you can create a program around your own individual needs, your current ability level, any pains or conditions you might already have, and how you can actually make a program that works for you and understand what that program is and how we progress to go forwards to actually build strength. So again, if you're interested in that, do take a look at that. So it's nevertooldtolift.com/ebook. But yeah, we want to make sure the strength training you do is at the right intensity and you're trying to cover as much of the body as possible. So I mentioned there about 7 functional movement patterns. So I tend to try and include big movement patterns that use multiple muscles at the same time. And that makes things a lot more efficient in the gym. So that might be some form of squat, some form of hip hinge, which could be like a bridge or a deadlift, some form of lunge. Then we've got push exercise where you're pushing something away from you or pushing yourself away from the floor like a push-up. We've got pull-up where you're pulling something towards you or pulling yourself up towards like a bar, like a pull-up. We've got rotation of the body against resistance. And then we've got what we call gait or carry, where you're carrying a weight. Again, that's 7 exercises there. You could split those into 2 different workouts and then maybe add another exercise you like in for the one that's only got the 3 there. And you've got a really thorough workout that works the whole body in 2 sessions a week, which is the 2 sessions you need to do to meet the physical activity guidelines, and tick that off. And then once you've been doing that consistently and you've been doing progressive overload with weights, where you're just gradually increasing the weight as things start to feel easier, you will then be taking the steps you need to that healthier, more active future. And then at that point, if you want to start adding in and tweaking the supplements you're taking and looking at all those other things that we mentioned earlier, that's when to do it. You do it after you've done the basics first. It's 80% first. Then we build everything else on top. A little bit of homework for you then. I want you to imagine that you are 80, 90, even 100 years old. And I want you to create your own Centenarian Decathlon. I want you to think about 10 things that you would love to be able to do at that age that other people might just assume is not a possibility. They're just accepted frailty as normal. Whereas I don't want you to think that like that. I want you to think about the activities you want to be able to do. And if you're watching us on YouTube, then please let us know in the comments. Just put your 10 things, or even if you only give us 5 of them, just give us an idea, because it might help other people create their own ones as well. If you're listening to this on the audio podcast, then either head over to YouTube and you can leave comments there, because again, it will help inspire others. Or if you just want to let me know or you have any questions about this, then please send me an email. It's chris@nevertoldtolift.com. So that's chris@nevertoldtolift.com. Then a second bit of homework for anyone who's not already meeting the guidelines is just have a think about some of the changes you could make to add in those walks, those minutes of aerobic activity, when you could do those sessions of muscle strengthening. And they can be at home and you don't necessarily need any equipment to get started with. And then what some of the exercises you might include in those workouts. But again, if you need help with that, do have a look at that free ebook that I have, nevertoldtolift.com/ebook. Or if you'd like a paperback copy of that, you can find that on Amazon. So just have a look and search Never Told to Lift on Amazon and you'll find that there. But again, the link is below. For now, I will see you in next Wednesday's episode.